In the 2023 presidential election, Peter Obi and Rabiu Kwankwaso together won over 8 million votes, more than enough combined to have changed the outcome of that election. They were in the same political space, they had the same declared opponent, and they never, not once, sat in the same room to negotiate a merger. Why? Because the real fight between these two men was never about Bola Ahmed Tinubu. It was never about APC or PDP. It was about something deeper, quieter, and far more consequential. Something Nigerian mainstream conversation has not clearly named. Before going further, this channel exists for one purpose: to give Nigerians clear, grounded political analysis. No noise, no distraction, just context. Stay with this because it goes deeper. To understand what happened, the story must go back to the political atmosphere between 2021 and 2022. At that time, the Nigerian electorate was restless. There was visible fatigue with the two dominant parties. Economic pressure was rising, insecurity was spreading, and public trust in political institutions was low. Into that space, two parallel forces began to take shape. On one side was the Labour Party, small, historically quiet, but suddenly becoming a vehicle for something new. It attracted urban voters, young professionals, and a large segment of Nigerians who felt disconnected from traditional party structures. It was not built on long-standing political machinery. It was built on energy, identity, and a sense of urgency. On the other side was the NNPP, not new in name, but newly relevant under Kwankwaso. Unlike the Labour Party, this was not a movement. It was an organized structure. Its strength came from years of political investment, particularly in Kano and across the Northwest. It had loyalists, networks, and a clear chain of command. In May 2022, Peter Obi made a move that changed the trajectory of the election. He left the PDP and joined the Labour Party. The decision appeared sudden to the public, but within political circles, it was understood as strategic. He needed a platform he could fully control, one that would not dilute his message or limit his reach. At the same time, Rabiu Kwankwaso had already secured his position within the NNPP. His influence was not theoretical, it was visible on the ground. His political base was concentrated, but it was deep and disciplined. As the election approached, conversations began behind closed doors. Representatives from both camps started exploring the possibility of a merger. The logic was simple: combine Obi's national appeal with Kwankwaso's northern strength, and the opposition would become a serious electoral force. For a moment, it seemed possible, but the talks collapsed. The official explanation was straightforward: disagreements over who would lead the ticket and who would take the vice presidential slot. It was presented as a deadlock over ambition, but that explanation does not fully account for what was at stake. There is a specific meeting that took place in Abuja, a conversation between representatives of both sides. Each camp later described that meeting differently. One side framed it as a near agreement that failed at the last minute. The other described it as fundamentally flawed from the start. That discrepancy matters, and it reveals something deeper about the nature of the disagreement. To understand that, it is necessary to look beyond personalities and into the structures shaping their decisions. First, there is the question of law. Under Nigeria's Electoral Act, political coalitions must follow formal procedures. There is no legal framework that enforces informal agreements between candidates. Any alliance between Obi and Kwankwaso would have relied entirely on trust, political trust, personal trust, and mutual risk. And in Nigerian politics, trust without enforcement is fragile. Second, there is party structure. The Labour Party at the time did not have the same level of institutional depth as the NNPP. It was growing rapidly, but its internal systems were still forming. The NNPP, on the other hand, had inherited years of political organization. It had a defined hierarchy and a tested method of mobilizing voters. These differences are not cosmetic. They shape how decisions are made, how loyalty is maintained, and how power is negotiated. Third, there is the question of federal power. The role of a vice president in Nigeria is not symbolic. It carries real influence. For Kwankwaso to accept that position would have meant placing his entire political structure under the authority of someone who had only recently joined his party environment. That is not a small concession, it is a structural shift. This is where the real conflict becomes clear. This was not simply a clash of personalities. It was a clash between two different models of political power. One model depends on mass mobilization, public sentiment, and rapid expansion. The other depends on structure, loyalty, and long-term control of territory. Without a strong institution to mediate between those models, cooperation becomes difficult. Now, looking at the outcome, it is clear who benefited. The ruling party entered the election facing a divided opposition. That division reduced the pressure on its campaign and fragmented the voter base that might have otherwise aligned against it. Even the PDP, despite its own internal challenges, retained relevance because neither alternative became dominant. But the consequences go beyond electoral advantage. For Peter Obi, the risk moving forward is clear. Political movements driven by energy must eventually convert into structure. Without that transition, they lose momentum. Public enthusiasm is powerful, but it is not permanent. For Rabiu Kwankwaso, the challenge is different. His strength is concentrated in a specific region. While that concentration gives him control, it also limits his national reach. Without expansion beyond that base, it becomes difficult to compete at the federal level. Looking ahead to 2027, the numbers still suggest that a coalition between these two forces could be viable. The combination of northern electoral strength and southern urban mobilization remains significant, but viability on paper does not guarantee execution in reality. Across Nigeria's geopolitical zones, the dynamics remain complex. The southeast continues to seek stronger representation at the highest level of government. The northwest, once a stable voting bloc, is becoming more contested. Political alliances are shifting, and no region can be taken for granted.
Behind the scenes, there are also stakeholders who rarely appear in public discussions. Business interests in the southeast, civil society groups in the north, and international observers all have a stake in how Nigeria's opposition evolves. They watch for signals, not just from candidates, but from the systems around them. There is also a figure, not publicly acknowledged, who was present during a critical moment in the negotiations between both camps. That presence suggests that the talks were more serious than publicly admitted and that the breakdown was not inevitable but the result of deeper, unresolved tensions. At this point, one thing becomes clear. If this analysis challenges existing assumptions, then it is important to pause and consider what it reveals before moving further. Because the implications are not limited to political elites, they extend directly to governance and everyday life. A fragmented opposition weakens competition, and when competition weakens, accountability also weakens. Federal power becomes more centralized, and state governments become more dependent on that center. The effects are not abstract. They show up in economic decisions, in policy outcomes, and in the daily experiences of citizens. The economic pressures Nigerians have faced in recent years, rising costs, currency instability, and policy shifts, exist within a political environment where opposition coordination has been limited. A stronger, unified opposition might not have changed every outcome, but it would have increased the political cost of major decisions. There is also a deeper social dimension. An Obi Kwankwaso ticket would have represented a combination that cuts across Nigeria's most sensitive fault lines, religion and ethnicity. A Christian Igbo candidate paired with a Muslim northern leader, both outside traditional power structures, would have carried symbolic weight. Its absence leaves those divisions intact and available for use in future political contests. Security is also connected to representation. In regions where people feel politically excluded, alternative systems of authority can emerge. These may not always be formal, but they fill gaps left by the state. A more inclusive political structure reduces those gaps. At this stage, it becomes necessary to state the reality clearly. The failure of that coalition was not just an opposition setback. It had broader implications for governance, economic stability, and national cohesion. And yet, the conversation often returns to personalities. This is where the analysis must shift. Nigeria does not need political actors to agree on a personal level. What it needs is a system that allows cooperation even when personal relationships are weak. That is the difference between a personality-driven system and an institution-driven one. As 2027 approaches, both Obi and Kwankwaso are adjusting their positions. One is working to stabilize a growing but fragile structure. The other is maintaining control over an established but regionally limited base. There is also the possibility that a third figure emerges, not necessarily as a candidate, but as a bridge, someone capable of coordinating between different political interests without being fully tied to either side. The next phase of Nigerian politics will depend on what happens in the spaces between parties, in negotiations, alliances, and institutional reforms. If those spaces remain weak, then the patterns of 2023 will repeat. And that brings the focus back to the original question. Why did two political forces with a shared opportunity fail to come together? The answer is not simply ambition. It is not just timing. It is not even primarily about individuals. It is about structure. It is about the absence of systems that can manage competing interests and produce stable outcomes. Until those systems exist, coalition politics in Nigeria will remain fragile. And when coalitions fail, it is not only politicians who lose, it is the country. Because in the end, the real conflict is not between two men. It is between two different ways of organizing political power in Nigeria. And until that conflict is resolved at a structural level, the consequences will continue to be felt far beyond election cycles, in governance, in economic life, and in the everyday realities of Nigerians. What makes this story even more revealing is that it does not end within Nigeria's borders. It extends outward into diplomatic rooms, foreign policy briefings, and diaspora communities where Nigeria's political future is constantly being assessed, discussed, and in subtle ways influenced. During the 2023 election cycle, countries like the United States and the United Kingdom did not openly support any candidate. Officially, they maintained neutrality. But neutrality does not mean disengagement. Behind the scenes, diplomatic observers and democracy-focused institutions were watching closely, not just the candidates, but the structure of the competition itself. Reports from civil society organizations connected to international bodies showed a clear concern, not about who would win, but whether Nigeria's opposition could function as a credible counterbalance at all. Because in any democracy, the strength of the opposition is not just a political detail. It is a signal. It tells the world whether power can be contested, whether leadership can be challenged, and whether governance is subject to pressure from outside the ruling circle. And in 2023, that signal was weak. The fragmentation between Peter Obi and Rabiu Kwankwaso was not just a domestic issue. It was observed internationally as a sign that Nigeria's political system still struggles to produce unified alternatives to power. That matters more than it appears.
Nigeria's influence within regional and continental organizations, from ECOWAS to the African Union, depends partly on its image as a functioning multi-party democracy. The stronger that image, the more weight Nigeria carries in diplomatic negotiations, economic partnerships, and regional leadership. But when one party appears dominant, not just by strength, but by default, because the opposition cannot organize itself, that credibility begins to erode. And those in power understand this. For the administration of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, managing not just governance but perception becomes part of the strategy. The presence of opposition matters, but so does the nature of that opposition. Fragmented opposition is easier to engage, easier to respond to, and easier to outmaneuver, both politically and diplomatically. Then there is the diaspora. Across cities like London, Houston, Toronto, and Johannesburg, Nigerian professionals followed the 2023 election with unusual intensity. Many of them were not just observers, they were participants, funding campaigns, organizing online, influencing narratives, and in some cases, returning home to vote. The obedient movement in particular drew significant strength from this global network. It was not just a Nigerian movement, it was a transnational one, shaped by Nigerians who had experienced other systems and wanted to see change reflected back home. But when the possibility of a broader coalition collapsed, something else happened quietly. That energy lost direction. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to create hesitation. Because political engagement, especially from a distance, depends on belief, and belief depends on coherence. When alliances fail at the highest level, it raises questions at the grassroots level. Questions about seriousness, about strategy, about whether the effort will lead anywhere meaningful. Now, as conversations about 2027 begin to take shape, that same diaspora network still exists. The infrastructure is there, the willingness to engage is there, but the trust has been tested. And the question slowly forming in those communities is simple. If a new coalition emerges, will it be different from the last one, or will it follow the same path, full of promise but unable to hold together under pressure? This pattern is not unique to Nigeria. Across different democracies, third-party movements and opposition coalitions often struggle in systems designed around clear winners and losers. In the United Kingdom, smaller parties have repeatedly found it difficult to convert influence into power. In India, broad opposition alliances have faced internal contradictions that limit their effectiveness. But Nigeria's case is more complex, because here, political identity is layered, shaped not just by ideology, but by ethnicity, religion, and region. Every alliance carries symbolic weight. Every decision signals something beyond policy. And that makes coalition building not just a strategic challenge, but a cultural one. Which brings the focus back to the arguments that continue to dominate public discussion. One of the most common is that the failure between Obi and Kwankwaso was simply about ego, that one refused to step down and the other refused to compromise. There is truth in that. Political ambition cannot be separated from political action, but stopping there misses the deeper issue. Because even if one had stepped down, the underlying tension would still exist. A movement built on mass enthusiasm does not easily submit to a structure built on long-standing hierarchy. And a structure built on loyalty does not easily dissolve into a movement driven by fluid, decentralized support. That tension would not disappear after the election. It would move into government, into decision-making, into appointments, into policy direction. Another argument suggests that one candidate clearly had more public support and should have led the ticket without resistance. But Nigerian elections do not operate on visibility alone. They operate on distribution, where votes come from, how they are secured, and how they are protected. A candidate can dominate public conversation and still lack the regional spread needed to win. In that sense, both Obi and Kwankwaso brought something essential, not identical, but complementary. And that is what makes the failure more significant. Then there is the argument that the outcome of the election would not have changed regardless, that structural issues within the electoral process would have determined the result anyway. That may or may not be true, but it does not remove the importance of the coalition itself. Because a unified opposition does more than contest an election. It shapes perception, it strengthens legal challenges, it raises the cost of irregularities, it forces greater scrutiny. Division, on the other hand, reduces that pressure. And then there is the most persistent misconception that this was simply a North versus South issue, that Kwankwaso represented the North, Obi represented the South, and their differences were inevitable. That narrative is appealing because it simplifies a complex reality, but it is also misleading. Both men ran national campaigns, both sought support beyond their regions, and both understood that no single region can decide a Nigerian presidential election alone. The failure was not geographic, it was structural. At this point, the story reaches a critical shift, because the focus can no longer remain on individuals. The real issue is the system that produced this outcome. Nigeria's political structure does not yet provide strong mechanisms for coalition building. It does not reward compromise in a predictable way. It does not protect agreements once they are made. And so everything returns to personal negotiation, which is unreliable, which is fragile, which is exactly what happened in 2023. This leads to a more difficult but necessary reframing.
Nigeria does not need political actors to like each other. Personal chemistry is not a requirement for functional governance. What Nigeria needs is an opposition system that can survive beyond personalities,
one that can produce alliances based on structure, not sentiment. The question for 2027, then, is not whether Peter Obi and Rabiu Kwankwaso will agree. It is whether Nigeria can build institutions that make their agreement less important. Because if the system remains the same, the outcome will likely repeat itself. Looking ahead, the movements are already underway. Obi's path depends on consolidation. The Labour Party must move from momentum to organization. Internal disputes must be resolved. Leadership structures must become clearer. Without that, the energy of 2023 risks fading into memory. Kwankwaso's path depends on expansion. His influence in Kano remains strong, but national relevance requires broader reach. The performance of his political allies at the state level will shape how far that influence can extend. And then there is the possibility of a third force, not necessarily a candidate, but a coordinator, someone capable of bridging gaps, aligning interests, and managing the kind of negotiations that failed before. These developments will not happen all at once. They will unfold gradually, through party meetings, state elections, quiet alliances, and public signals that may seem small but carry deeper meaning. There are signs to watch. If both camps maintain distance without hostility, there is still space for negotiation. But if that distance turns into open criticism, it suggests that cooperation is no longer being considered. And once that line is crossed, rebuilding trust becomes significantly harder. In the end, this story returns to the same question it began with. Why did two political forces, with the numbers, the momentum, and the opportunity, fail to come together? The answer is no longer hidden. It is not just about ambition. It is not just about timing. It is about a political system that does not yet know how to hold competing interests together long enough to produce a stable outcome. Until that changes, coalition politics in Nigeria will remain uncertain, and that uncertainty will continue to shape not just elections, but governance itself. Because when structure fails, the consequences do not stay at the top. They move downward into policy, into the economy, and into the daily lives of millions. And that is where the real impact is felt.